We're getting you ready for the World Cup by previewing every World Cup team, and this one is Australia, the Socceroos. Finally, another country that calls it soccer, so we are not alone. And if you want to make fun of me calling it soccer, I'll be streaming watch-alongs to the entire World Cup, every single match. Link to the Twitch is down in the description. I hope you'll join me and my mustache. This is out of the fabulously interesting Group D, which is essentially Group C from the last World Cup with Tunisia and Peru switched out. So I'm assuming at the 2026 World Cup, it will just be France, Denmark, and Australia, since those World Cups are only going to have 3 teams in a group. But that's not what we're here to talk about today. Australia is back at it again. They have qualified for the World Cup. How did they do it? Well, in typically uncomfortable Australian fashion. Now, Australia is an Asian qualifying, and in order to make that work, you have to get out of your first group. Now, these are usually pretty easy groups, and Australia made it look easy. They won all 8 matches. Kuwait and Jordan, solid teams that were trying to contest them, but both of them beat each other up, and there was really no threat to Australia. But going into the final round of qualifying, there was a big threat to Australia. The draw was pretty tough. It was Japan, Saudi Arabia, Oman, China, Vietnam, and Australia, but the Aussies looked like they were fine. They came out and they won their first 3 matches in qualifying. The issue for Australia is that they then won just 1 of their final 7 matches and very nearly didn't even finish 3rd. Now, if you finish 3rd, you go to this playoff system. If you finish in the top 2, you qualify automatically. And Australia, by the end of it all, was nowhere near finishing in 2nd and very close to finishing in 4th. The surprise of qualifying, Oman won the same number of games as Australia. They just lost 1 more. Despite those poor results, Australia had actually clinched being in 3rd in the group before the final match day, which was a loss to Saudi Arabia. And that 3rd place finish means you play the other team that finished 3rd in the other Asian group. And unlike previous years, because this qualifying cycle was disrupted by the COVID-19 pandemic, that had to happen instead of a home and away in Qatar. 1 match, all the marbles. And this is a tricky match. The United Arab Emirates, while they've only been to the World Cup 1 time, actually beat Australia at the Asian Cup in 2019. They are not a pushover, and in the one-off match, that was a problem. Australia scored in the 53rd minute, but the United Arab Emirates scored just a few minutes later to make it 1-1. Australia needed a late heroic goal to win the Asian playoff 2-1. It's actually something that Australia is fairly familiar with. Back in 2018, Australia had to play a home and away against Syria, which it did end up winning, but only after going to extra time. So the last 2 winners of the Asian World Cup qualifying playoff are the same. It's Australia the last 2 times. You win that playoff, then you go to the Intercontinental playoff, which rotates who you play against, but this time it's Australia against Peru. It was a pretty even match back and forth that Australia ended up winning on penalties thanks to the dancing heroics of Andrew Redmayne, who was making like his 3rd ever appearance for the Australian national team, north of 30 years old, but he had this elaborate dancing penalty saving technique that ended up winning the penalty shootout for Peru, or at least contributing to it against Peru. Australia's at the World Cup, not Peru. Just so we're clear. And that result was some nice hearty revenge for Australia after losing to Peru at the previous World Cup to knock them out in the group stage. This unlikely World Cup qualification from Australia continues a fabulous run, the only and longest fabulous run that Australia has had on the international soccer scene, which I can say they're the Socceroos. This is their 5th straight World Cup qualification in the 3rd time that they've done it through the Intercontinental playoff, which is insane, but they've made it 5 straight times. Before that, Australia had only made it 1 time ever. The bad news, though, is Australia hasn't won a match at the World Cup since 2010. That was when Australia beat Serbia 2-1 in South Africa. That doesn't mean they haven't been competitive, because Australia actually, despite the fact they didn't win, had a fabulous World Cup in 2018. In the swan song of national team legend Tim Cahill, Australia managed to play France incredibly close. They gave up an own goal in the 81st minute on a super unlucky deflection that condemned them to defeat 2-1 against the eventual World Cup champions, and then in the next match, they drew Denmark. The only real surprise result that went against them was a 2-0 loss to Peru, but Australia absolutely brought their A game. The problem for them is that form doesn't seem to have carried over into any competition since then. The Asian Cup happened a year later in 2019. That's their most recent continental competition they have played in. In the group stage, they finished 2nd behind Jordan, who of course they did end up beating in World Cup qualifying, but still wasn't a fabulous result. They lost the opening match to Jordan before beating Palestine and Syria. They then wandered into the round of 16 and managed to beat Uzbekistan on penalties, but couldn't score a goal against them for 120 minutes before losing to the United Arab Emirates in the quarterfinals, who of course they beat in the Asian World Cup playoff eventually. Since Australia has only been playing in the Asian Federation since 2004, this actually ties their worst ever finish at the Asian Cup. They won it in the previous edition in 2015, and they were the runners-up in 2011. And add insult to injury, the man that just carries the flag for Australia and is synonymous with Australia at the World Cup, Tim Cahill, who has scored some of the most fabulous and exciting goals in recent World Cups, he is finally no longer a part of the team. So who steps into that void? My player to watch for Australia, Jamie Maclaren. Now, Jamie Maclaren might be 29 years old, so he should already be in the swing of things when it comes to the national team, but he's been in the shadow of other forwards like Tim Cahill. In World Cup qualifying this time around, Maclaren scored 7 of his 8 career goals for Australia just in that qualifying section. The center forward plays at Melbourne City, and he's off to a flying start in the Australian League as well. Maclaren scored 4 goals his first 3 matches of the season in the Australian League, which has actually put him 8th all time, the Australian Men's National League goal scoring all-time record. I worded that so well. They give a Nobel Prize for literature because I think I just spoke it. Australia is searching for its new number 9. It did not have it necessarily against Peru, or it did not have it necessarily against the UAE, where Jackson Irvine and Aiden Hrustic scored the 2 important goals for Australia, but Jamie Maclaren showed over the course of qualifying he can be the relied upon striker, and he's in fantastic form. So if Australia is going to do something, the player that they need to do it is Jamie Maclaren. The rest of the team around him is actually in pretty good form as well. Australia rolled out with a 4-5-1 in the World Cup playoffs, both the Asian one and the overall one. And that 4-5-1 provided a very, very solid middle 3. And that is the key to success for Australia. Aaron Moy is having a career resurgence with Celtic in the Scottish League. He is the anchor behind Aiden Hrustic and Jackson Irvine, who both have shown the ability to contribute massively. Tom Rogic is off the bench. He is an X-Factor player, big, lanky, creative, attacking midfielder. But outside of that, in Australia's 4-5-1, it gets a little trickier. Matt Ryan is a really, really solid goalkeeper. That's something Australia seems to always have. But the defense in front of him is not so much. Against Peru, it was Kai Rolls, who plays at Hearts of Midlothian, and Bailey Wright, who plays with Sunderland in the 2nd Division of England. On the outside, they do have Captain Matthew Leckie, but he is the type of player that he does what you expect him to do, but he's not somebody that provides inspiration, at least outside of his leadership capacity. That means that this team is a bit weaker defensively than it has been in past World Cups, and it is lacking that offensive spark. I mean, both the goals they scored against the UAE came from the middle of midfield. Not necessarily a good combination, and as you can probably tell based off of their form coming into this tournament, their odds of advancing are not very good at all. Same situation as Tunisia. Australia has to beat Tunisia if they want to have a chance of getting out of this group, and then they're going to need a player like Maclaren, or perhaps Matthew Leckie, or Aaron Moy, who does have that class that he used to use in the Premier League back in the day, to provide a moment of inspiration. Maybe you get a penalty, maybe you get a set piece, somebody finds a way to put the ball on the back of the net, Matt Ryan stands on his head, and they can get a result against Denmark the way they did at the last World Cup that perhaps opens the door. But if we go back to World Cup qualifying, their results against other World Cup teams were not good. They played Japan and Saudi Arabia twice. They got a grand total of 1 point. The best match they've played over the last 2 years, really, was the match against Peru, where they played them even and beat them on penalties, which isn't a good sign going forward. It does feel like the ability to miraculously qualify for the World Cup every 4 years is papering over bigger issues in the national team setup with Australia and in player development. But at the moment, every time they get to the World Cup, they give people some headaches. And so even though this team looks like it shouldn't be able to do that, I'm willing to give them every chance. I do, however, think Australia is going to finish in last in this group behind Tunisia. They will probably draw, honestly, because Australia and Tunisia are both relying on experience and toughness to get points, and they will not want to concede. But you should keep this binge going. You just watched one video previewing the World Cup. Well, we're previewing every freaking team. Here's a playlist. It's over here. It's right here.